Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for our virtual genealogy program, Finding Female Ancestors in Their Clubs and Societies. I'm Pam Taylor, manager at Harford County Public Library's Joppa branch. This performance is being recorded and will be available along with a handout at hcpl.org. hcplonline.org on the HCPL Universe page for the next 4 weeks. Now let's get on with the show. We're thrilled to have Lisson with us back this evening. She's a great presenter, lovely to work with, and has such a passion for genealogy. Lisa is a leading genealogy expert and the founder of Are You My Cousin?, a comprehensive online resource dedicated to empowering family history enthusiasts worldwide. Through her website, engaging YouTube channel, and sought-after speaking engagements, Lisa equips researchers with practical strategies and clear tutorials to navigate the exciting world of genealogy and to cultivate their family trees with confidence. Recognized for her expertise, Lisa has authored numerous genealogy articles, created hundreds of helpful YouTube videos, and presented internationally. Her latest book, 100 Questions for Grandma, published by Callisto Media, offers a valuable guide to unlocking cherished family stories. Lisa will be using a PowerPoint during her presentation this evening, and you can adjust what you're seeing on your screen by using the screen view in Zoom. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom, and at the end of the show, I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. We would really appreciate if you would take time to complete this quick survey right after the credits. We use your input to choose topics for our virtual genealogy program, so it is time really well spent, and it just takes a moment. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to once again introduce Lisa Lisson.
Thanks, Pam. I am so excited to be here tonight. It's fun to see where everybody's from. They've been popping it in the chat over there. So let me pull up and go ahead and share my slides, and we will get on with what we're talking about today, which is finding our females ancestors in their clubs and societies. This is actually a really passionate topic of mine, and so I am thrilled to be able to actually share it with you. Hang on one second, just make a couple adjustments so I can actually see as well. All right, perfect. We are ready to go. All right, so we are going to definitely talk about those women in the family tree, and we are going to be in our time together talking about, well, we're going to talk about why it's so difficult, what some of those difficulties are when it comes to researching our female ancestors, the women in that family tree, because, well, I expect we all have a lot of trouble with that. It's very easy to have those issues. We're going to talk about women in their communities. Obviously, we're going to talk about the types of clubs and societies that perhaps our ancestors may have been participating in. And we're going to also kind of talk about then not only what might have been available, but, well, how to find out what was specific to them and where we can find them in the records as well. Now, I do have a spoiler alert because if you don't remember anything else that I talk about tonight, here's what you have to remember. If something was important to your ancestor, it is absolutely important to you in your research. So I'm giving it to you right up front, guys. This is your take home. This is what I want you to remember. If something was important to your ancestor, it is important to you. All right, so that's going to become more clear. We're going to talk about that, what that means going forward, but that's kind of what all of this is going to be based on. All right, now finding that woman, finding those female ancestors can get hard, and it can get hard, well, rather quickly. So don't feel like it's just you. Okay, if we were in a room together, if we were face to face, I would ask you to raise your hands and tell me, how many of you, have genealogy brick walls, and how many of those brick walls, those really tough problems that we have, how many of those involve women in the family tree? And I can guarantee you, probably a good portion of you would be raising your hands, and I would be raising my hand with you. I would be waving it actually, because it seems like many of the brick walls that I've come upon have to do with the women in my family tree. But I'm slowly making my way through them. All right. But why? Why is it so hard? Well, you have to remember, so the women in our tree, our female ancestors, they actually didn't always create a lot of formal records, depending certainly on the time of period you're researching. And if they didn't create a lot of records, then, well, there's not a record for us to find. But then here we have, all right, they got married. So when you think about it, if a woman in your family tree got married at, say, 18 to 20, in that age range, She was only in her father's household using that maiden name for, say, 18 or 20 years. Out of an 80-year life, that's, not a large portion of it. It's only, 25% of it. So she wasn't really using that maiden name for much of her life. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But then what happens when she had multiple marriages? So maybe your ancestor, she had a maiden name and then she got married, but then unfortunately her husband passed away. She remarried, so she had another name. So here we have somebody who had three names. But, well, of course, what happens if they had two husbands or three husbands, or maybe they had four marriages? Yes, I see that all the time. So, when we're seeing these multiple name changes for women, it does tend to really it can cause a struggle because we have to remember and keep in our minds who she was at that moment in her life. Throw in there again, they're not creating a lot of records, partly because, well, they didn't necessarily have a lot of rights when you think about it, for many of our ancestors. So it's no wonder we're struggling to find those ancestors, to find them in the records. And sometimes for our women, and oftentimes actually for the women in our family tree, it's less about finding that one record that says this is who she is or this is her maiden name, who names a document that names a daughter or names gives a maiden name, but it's oftentimes really about learning more about who she is as a woman, who she is as her, and kind of building those indirect connections and putting the clues together. So it's, again, oftentimes you have to find more and look more places for the women in the family tree and then pull the conclusions together as opposed to being able to find that direct record sometimes. Now, that doesn't mean that these women were not in what I would call the regular genealogy records or those traditional genealogy records that we look at. And, so what do I refer to when I'm talking about the regular genealogy records? We do see them in census records. Certainly 1850 forward, we're going to see naming of every of the individuals in the household, so we will see the women listed. 1790 up to 18 through the 1840 census, they're going to appear as a tick mark, so you might have to do a little math in your head. And then you will see women if they were heads of household. So there were some instances if they were a widow or acting as a femme sole, you might see them listed as the head of household, but not as often, certainly. We're going to be looking for them in the birth, marriage, and death records. Those are kind of the traditional, those are the records we know to look at, right? Church records, church baptism records, church marriage records. Those church records are oftentimes places that we want to look and that we do look. We include those are some of the first records we go to. Maybe not so much, you might not have felt so much to look for your ancestor in a court record, but women were and do appear in court records. They could be sued. My fourth great grandmother appeared in a grand jury indictment for living in in an adultery. So it was okay. There's some of the family dirty laundry we're airing, right? But that was back in the 1840s or 1820s. So we do see them appearing in court records. They could be, and then of course wills and estates. So they might be appearing in a husband's record. They might be appearing in, they might have their own will and estate, depending on their circumstances. They could be appearing in a father or parent's will or estate record. So these are kind of the usual records that we would typically go to. Court records, maybe not quite the first records, but we do get to those eventually. So those are the ones that we kind of set aside. That's the first round of research. But because sometimes we're not seeing a lot of other records for our ancestors, our female ancestors, we may not see a ton of them in certainly the court records. We're not seeing them buying land frequently. We're not seeing them act as their own legal representative in many of the court proceedings. They might have to have a male relative acting as their legal guardian in what I think they call it their next friend, I think is what they call it, in court proceedings. So we have a tendency sometimes, I think, to think back that maybe the women in our family tree, they're really just kind of sitting home doing their thing, taking care of the house. But I think I want to challenge you to think about your ancestors a little bit differently. I don't think they were just living quietly in the background. On the contrary, I think women were actually being very active. They were active in their communities, they were active in their churches, they were active in causes and things that were important to them. And so we have to, if we think about it in those terms, we start to recognize that, hey, maybe if we understand their lives a little bit better, if we can start to understand what it was that was important to them during that time period of their life, what were some of their interests, then maybe we have an opportunity to actually find their records in some unlikely places. And that's when we really have to turn to these community types of records, their clubs, their societies, things that were important to them. And the reason we do that is the reason these community records can be so important to them, and I'm gonna show you a lot of examples for that, is that women were oftentimes, they were the communicators in a family. So we were oftentimes seeing them being the communicators, the letter writers. They might be writing back and forth, the journal writers, and keeping the diaries. So they may be taking care of that. They were oftentimes the cooks in the family. I don't want to say the men didn't cook, but in traditional gender roles early on were showing that the women were the primary the cooks. They were creating the community cookbooks. Okay. They were volunteering. They were volunteering in the community. They were in their churches. They were writing up what they were doing. They were hosting events to sponsor causes. So they were very active in their communities. And that's why we have to get into those community records to see if we can find evidence of our ancestors. So I want to think about their clubs and societies. And before I do that, well, I really want to think about what are some of your clubs and societies that you might actually be a part of. All right. Think about this for a second. I expect many of you, because we were talking about genealogy research, I expect many of you are part of a genealogy society. You might be part of a club, a card club, say a bridge club, canasta club, bunco. Maybe you're part of a church group. So whether a church as a whole, maybe a small Sunday school class, maybe a smaller women's class, maybe you're part of the choir. I did the handbells for many years. Maybe you're part of a service organization. So maybe you're part of a local community service organization. It could be one that has branches across the country. It could be one, that's actually quite local to your community. Maybe that's what it is. But in today's time, so a lot of our goal when we're in things such as a genealogy society, maybe we're in a church group doing service or a service organization doing service, is we want to get the word out about what it is we do, right? And we like to document what we do. And so what do? We go to Facebook, right? So we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and so it's not unusual. So if you were looking for me, you would find me in the pages of a genealogy society. Perhaps you might see a picture of me at an event. You might see a picture of me actually speaking, but you might see me on a membership role, right? Or in the newspaper. If I've done a service project, maybe I'm working on a service project. So you might see that written up because we want to get those causes out into the world. We want people to see those kinds of things. Another thing, I was part of a running group. And so we have our photographs taken just about on a weekly basis. And so we have those in our different social media. Occasionally it'll show up on a digital newspaper archive somewhere, but you will see that taking place. And though that's when we have to then stop and think, okay, if I do that, what about the women in my family tree? What organizations, what types of clubs, what types of causes, what types of things would my great great grandmother have been involved in? Okay. Or my great grandmother, what would she have been involved in as a young woman, say in, the 1920s? What would have been of interest to her for where she lived? So I have to understand where she lived. I have to understand that community and kind of start thinking about, what could be there? So I need to understand what that means is as researchers, we have to understand our ancestors' community quite a bit, all right, and getting into that. Now, I think one of the first places that many of us can go and look for our ancestors would be in a type of community setting, a type of organizational setting, would actually be, say, church organizations. And church and faith really played a part in many of the communities that our ancestors were living in. And because of that, I think we need to look at the women's roles and her activities in the church. And so things might be like attendance. Um, it might be that they had minutes for women's groups. Minutes might be, those are harder to find, but they might be as part of the church historian, might have some of those. You might find photographs of women teaching vacation Bible school. Again, they would be kind of the traditional gender roles that we would think about from, say, early 1900s. If we're looking at your great grandmother or my great grandmother, um, they oftentimes would create cookbooks, church directories, church histories, and they would write up perhaps about the women in the church, people maybe who was part of that particular group. Because a church directory, when you think about it, it's sort of like a yearbook. And so they would have oftentimes their photographs of family units, but then they might also have photographs of, the different church women's groups, the men's groups, the women's groups, the choir, all of that. So you can potentially find those kinds of things there. You would To find these, where I recommend that you actually look, if you know the church, would be special collections. Most churches have a church historian. Sometimes you might have to really ask several people sometimes to find that one person. But even the small churches that I've done a lot with some of the rural churches in rural North Carolina, and I'm always surprised because there's usually one person who is in charge of those kinds of records. So that would be one place to start. Now, when you are looking for the women's groups in a church, how do you find that? Well, if you know the church that your ancestors were part of, and that's a good portion of the battle right there. You don't have to work quite as hard, because basically what you would do would be to reach out to that church and find out, what were the women's groups then. And they may currently still be the same ones, they may be different ones, but you would find out, talk to that historian, talk to some of the women in the church, and find out about kind of the history of some of the women's groups. And you might find, again, those write-ups in church newsletters, church bulletins. Does this always tell you who their father was, what their maiden name was? No, not directly, but it does put her in a specific time and in a specific place. So if you find her among those church records, you would find her there and be able to add that piece to her of data to your research. Now, if you do not know the church, so if you're looking for church groups for your ancestor, you know that you suspect that that could be a part of something that was important to her, then what we have to do is actually research the community around her. So oftentimes we get those hats and we understand, if we've looked at the community as a whole, that faith was important to that community. So which church did your ancestor go to? So I look at the community, but then I also, when I'm trying to determine the most likely church or place of worship that an ancestor was attended, then I actually will look and see. I start with, well, what's closest? I'll turn to the city directories and try to map it out and see which one's the closest one. And at that point, then I will check with each of the churches to find out what were the women's groups there, and talk to that church historian. And to be honest, sometimes I have to go to two or three churches because our ancestors didn't always go to the one that you think they went to. But don't let that sway you. This takes time. Absolutely. I'll tell you that straight up. But it can be worth the effort, because when you find your ancestors in a specific church, not only does it help you with the women in your family tree, but it can help you with the entire family. Other things would be church organizations that can have been around for many years. And so, to give you an idea of kind of some of the ones that you might want to get started with, um, that actually can be pretty well documented, would be the Women's Missionary Union, the WMU, because that was founded in 1888. That is from the Baptist Church. It's actually one of the largest Protestant women's organizations, and it's still in existence today. Most churches have some type of most Baptist churches will have a WMU group, and you will find write-ups about them in their local in the local newspapers. The United Methodist Women as well. They founded theirs in 1869, so they have a women's group as well. National Council of Catholic Women, founded in 1920 to bring the Catholic women organizations together. Now, most of these are still in existence today. They have a long history, and you can find them written up along with some of their, sometimes they'll have their rosters, sometimes there'll be records on their individual programs that they have presented, some of the works that they have done. You can still find those in newspapers today. For those of you if you're researching your Jewish ancestors, the National Council of Jewish Women, founded in 1893, is the kind of the overall umbrella organization for some of the individual Jewish women organizations that are out there. And then, of course, individual churches had their own women's groups that they might have had. So they might have created their own groups based on their membership need or their community need that they are serving. And so you may want to, particularly if you're with some of those smaller churches, you may just need to reach out and see what they have. Again, at this point, your church historian can be one of your best friends when it comes to researching into these church records and these church organizations. The Dorcas Society is another one. This one is actually, again, still in existence today. And it was actually popular in the 1800s, and they would provide clothing and other items to persons in need. So obviously they were a service organization, and they are many of the churches today, they were often church-based, and they are throughout the world. So you will still see this one in existence today as well. Again, looking through the churches to see who had what, and looking at some of their newsletters as they would promote and get the word out that this is what the women were doing. This is the projects that they were supporting. And so they would advertise themselves and write-ups about in the newspapers, church, and the church newsletters. Now, here's a really interesting one. This is what I call the out of the box kind of thinking. So we have to think things a little different, remember, that sometimes while our ancestors, again, the women, maybe their thing wasn't to be part of a service organization, but maybe they were good cooks, and they were part of an organization and community organization or a church circle that would put together a cookbook and sell it. And this would be a fundraiser. I think many of us, if we sit and think about it, I know I still have some from my grandmother. They're the little spiral bound books, that skinny little books that sit on my bookshelf downstairs. And so these are little church and community cookbooks that have been around for years. And they have recipes. So each of the members from the group would donate a few recipes. They would put it together and sell the cookbook. So this was a fundraising way to raise funds for either the running of their club, their organization. Maybe it was to raise funds for service type of things. But our ancestors would donate money there. Now, they would donate the recipes. Now, you have to think about this for a second. And I had to stop and think, because I thought, cookbooks. Now, this is Genealogy by Cookbook. This is really a little bit out there. But what does it do? So what does a church cookbook, what does a community cookbook do for you in your research? Well, each woman, again, would donate her recipes, and that cookbook would actually act as almost a microcosm of their community. It tells you who they hung out with, basically. Okay, so it put them in time and place. So it would tell you, and this is an example of the Ladies' Society of the First Presbyterian Church of Dayton, Ohio, published in 1886. So if you find your ancestor in this little cookbook, then you know that in 1886, she was in part of this community, part of this congregation in Dayton, Ohio. We also know a little bit about her personal views because she's part of the Presbyterian Church, so we could do a little research to understand what the Presbyterian believed, so we could get a little bit of understanding about perhaps what they believed. Now, when the women were putting together a cookbook, the really nice thing is that you would often find, you might find your ancestor, but you might also find a few generations. You might find sisters, you might find mothers and daughters who were donating recipes, because think about this. If you are a woman and part of the group, and your group is putting together a cookbook, and these are very common, you're going to donate, you're going to submit a recipe or two, right? Because if you don't, people are going to start talking about you. They're going to say, oh, she's not a very good cook. She's not going to submit anything. And so they're not going to do this. This was a big deal. So you're going to have the women are going to be there. So if your ancestor was part of it, she is likely going to have donated something. So let's take a little bit closer look at this particular cookbook. I will tell you, I found this on Google Books. You will find a lot of these older ones on Google Books. And here's a little recipe out of it that I pulled. This is a boiled chicken pot pie. I do not think I'll be making this for dinner tonight, just saying. And it is submitted by Mrs. James Stockstill. Now, I have to be honest, I would really have preferred for them to have put her first name and not Mrs. James Stockstill. But this particular cookbook put this here. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go with what it gave me because maybe I'm trying to figure out who she is and what her maiden name was. Does it tell me her maiden name is? No, unfortunately, it didn't. But it does give me a point that I can start with, which is to research her husband a lot for research into her husband more. So perhaps researching his records, I could find her maiden name or find other relatives that they might have been in contact with. So that might reveal her married name and or her maiden name as well. I do know that she's living in Dayton, Ohio in 1886. I know that she's part of this First Presbyterian Church. And so that does, again, tell me a little bit about her views as well. I would actually also go in and in the cookbook and look for other stock still women to see who else might have be potentially related. So my next step in my research plan would actually be to then research the Stockstills in the Stockstill family in Dayton, Ohio, and specifically try to see if I could find more church records that document this family a little bit more. Now, when you're in these cookbooks, this is another thing that kind of I realized was that many of these little cookbooks and have a little bit of a history in the front or the back of them. This is the same thing, very similar if you've been researched in city directories. Oftentimes they'll have a little bit of a history section about the community, at the front or the back. Same thing with church cookbooks, community cookbooks. And what I found was actually a little pen and ink drawing of their First Presbyterian Church. And it tells us, guys, right down here at the bottom, it says it's at the corner of 2nd and Ludlow Streets in Dayton, Ohio. So what does that tell me? What that tells me is, because I know where the church is, this is 1886. This family likely lived close to the church. They were not living 20 miles out and driving in for church on Sunday mornings. All right. This was 1886. They were living close. And so, within the blocks, I would think within the city blocks around the church. So I thought this was a really a good place to actually kind of place this particular Stockstill family. It helps me to help perhaps separate them out from others who might live in other parts of the city. So that was just an important little note that I made in the back of my head for my research plan. Now here's another one. This is the Westford Cookbook. It's called Tested Recipes. This is by the Ladies of the Congregational Church of Westford, Vermont. This is from 1909. Again, I found this on Google Books. Just a great source to find these types of things. And here we have succotash soup, another recipe I will not be making. But what we have here is Mabel Bailey. So we know that in 1909, Mabel Bailey was in Westford, Vermont. We do not know whether this is a married name or a maiden name because they don't indicate that, but we do know she's there. We know her name is Mabel. And so we could look for other Baileys to see if we might find other women in the family that are in this book as well. We know a little bit about her faith, and we would want to be able to look and go into and see if there are other church records because she is part of that church to see if she's part of those church records as well. So this is just kind of a sample of what you can possibly find in these records for in cookbook records. So I think that's just kind of an interesting way of looking at what it is our ancestors did and where it was they to kind of get an idea of who they were, what was important to them, whether it's their faith, whether it's service, whether it's food type things. So is this a really significant record? It can be, because if there are not many records for Mabel, this could be the only one that actually puts her in a time and place. In this case, Vermont, 1909. And so for a Bailey researcher, this could actually be quite a major find. All right, now let's shift a little bit and let's think about civic and reform groups. So we have lots of different types of groups and civic groups that our ancestors may have participated in. Oftentimes, we do think first about some of the um, faith-based groups, because that was such a large part of the founding of America in many of the communities. But there were definitely civic and reform groups as well. I think one of the biggest ones we think about would be the suffragette societies that were out there. That would definitely be one. But there's the Women's Exchange, there's the Temperance Society. There is, I think there's the Women's Exchange. There's also the Eastern Star. So again, these organizations were all created. They oftentimes had, records. They would have attendance records. They had newsletters of their own, and they would often be written up because, again, they want to promote what they were doing. I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes. Now, I would love to say that I can find one of my ancestors as a suffragette. Unfortunately, I have not. I would really like to, but I have not. But if you think your ancestor was a suffragette, if you think that was, then you need to start looking in the newspapers for her, because they held meetings, all right? And they wanted to publicize their meetings. They wanted to be visible because they wanted to get their point across. They wanted to be out there. They wanted the people to know who they were. They were, and so you will find that out there. And the other thing I would tell you when it comes to suffragettes would be, don't overlook the African American suffragettes as well as immigrant suffrage groups, because they were out there. They were making important contributions as well, and they were going to be written up in the newspaper. So here's an example. This is the Evening World. This is from New York, New York, from March 2nd, 1912. And what we have here is Mrs. Pankhurst gets 2 months for London raid. So this is actually a newspaper article that the New York newspaper picked up. It's from London, and it's talking about the raid that was in London for the suffragettes, and they have 124 women on trial. It's a lot of women on trial. But this is a really fabulous article. It talks through the article. It talks about the women that were there, and there were follow-up articles as well. One of the things I wanted to point out for this is that even though this particular event occurred in London, and would go through and name some of the women that were arrested with her, then it was picked up in New York. So you do not limit your search, or don't narrow your view for your newspaper research to just say the area or the town where your ancestor lived. Consider a regional, and in this case, this ended up being an international event that went around the world. But be sure and widen that and realize that larger newspapers will pick up things like suffragette type movements and activity in other papers. So when you see something like this, again, puts the women in time and place, definitely tells us something about her, what her views are, what it is she wants. I'm going to then, if I find this, then absolutely, you're going to head for the court records. Because remember, women would end up in court records. I would look for follow-up newspaper articles that would name more of the women. So if you're looking for your ancestor, and see what happened, as well as looking for perhaps the arrest records, because you may pick up a maiden name in those as well. So you have a number of options for that, for finding those, for adding to your research plan that you could then further your research into the women. Here's another great little record. I actually found this over at ancestry.com. This is actually English suffragettes who were arrested between 1906 and 1914. All right, so how cool is that? So you're seeing, as a suffragette, they're making a stand and they are actually getting arrested. And so what we find, they have an alphabetized list here, and we see, here we have Sophia Albert. And I believe, if I remember correctly, these are actually, some of the women have been arrested more than once, and you can see this person has only been arrested once, but this one looks like she's been arrested several times for activity. So you can start to see that as well. Again, they do not indicate on this particular record, it looks like whether married or not, but you could then potentially find them written up perhaps in newspapers and find more records, more court records on their arrest. Some of the women's groups would also have, or there were newspapers out there that were specific to women and women's issues, women's rights. And so there was the Women's Journal that was out there. It's called the Women's Journal and Suffrage News. And this was actually ran from 1870 to 1931. That's a pretty long run, actually. And it's primarily was focused at women's rights. It was, obviously starting with suffrage. And it went for many years. It was written by Lucy Stone, her husband, Henry Brown Blackwell. And it was initially more on suffrage, but it did later turn into more on women's rights. So this is a really interesting article newspaper that ran. So there were newspapers that were focused on women and women's issues. So this is another place to potentially find your ancestor who might have been very civic minded, very women's rights focused, because they want to get the information out there, right? Now, another interesting one, there is the Women's Trade Union League. I believe this actually started in England, and it lasted from about 1903 to 1950, so a good chunk of time. And this was the first national association that was dedicated to organizing women's workers. Again, Women's Trade Union League. So you can see, they actually are having a parade here. They are getting it out. They're demonstrating. So if your ancestor was part of this particular group, you might want to do some newspaper searches to see if you can find them listed among the roles for this particular worker as well. And I'm going to show you some search strategies in just a moment for this type of thing. Then there's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, another one. So this is another type of organization your ancestor may have been in. That was founded in 1874 in Cleveland, Ohio. This is actually a little excerpt, and this was out of their newspaper, one of their publications called the First Quarter Century of Women's Christian Temperance Union out of Salem, New Jersey. So it was written in 1909. And I thought one of the things I was kind of pointing out here that I actually found a young woman, she was single. It mentions they're talking about a celebration that they had, and that Miss Mary F. Lathrop, a bright young lady scarcely out of her teens, not only charmed the children but all ages with her adaptability. So it's talking about some of the speakers, some of the performers there. And what I thought was interesting is Miss Mary Lathrop. So we know if you are a Lathrop researcher, if we find her here, what we're seeing is that Mary is single because she's listed as Miss. We know that she's a young lady scarcely out of her teens. So this is a clue. Okay, so maybe she's we'll estimate 20. We don't know exactly how old, but this was written in 1909. We'll say she's 20. We can do the math, so we can get an estimated birth year on her if we're so we can actually get a little bit of perhaps age. Again, it's an educated guess, but it would get us a starting point there as well. And so we can start to, as we read through these, we start to understand and pick out the clues as to, again, in this case, an age. If we're a Lathrop researcher and we know that Mary does get married, then we know that at this point, at least, she's still single. So we would not look for a marriage record at this point in time. We would look for it after 1909. So we want to make sure we're paying attention to how the articles are worded to pick up those little clues for our ancestors. Now, this was one I always absolutely loved. Again, this is the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is of Illinois, and don't you just love it? They actually took photographs. This is actually in the Library of Congress. But what I would not give to have one of my ancestors in one of these organizations, not only do you have a photograph, but then they nicely, right out here, they tell you who everybody is. Now, would that not be lovely? If only the women in my tree did that, right? But they didn't, and I'm okay okay with that. I'll get over it. So, but it does, it listed out each one with Miss and Mrs. in there as well. So we know who is married, who's not, and where they're from. So again, we have that potential to actually find photographs as well. Another interesting civic and type of organization that we might find would be something called the Women's Exchange Movement. Now, this is actually the it was founded in 1832, and it was established by philanthropic women who wanted to help other women sell handiwork and to create an income. Because what was happening in some cases is that women that households were needing to bring in a little more income. And so, but it really wasn't acceptable for genteel women to go out, and earn money outside the house. They might have become newly widowed. They might suddenly find themselves kind of head of the household, but it didn't look good. Genteel women, however you want to define that, did not go out and work, so to speak. So this organization was actually founded, or movement was founded in order to help the women, kind of have almost a cottage type of industry, I think is how we would think of it today. And so they helped women work outside the home and would place their handiwork in places. So you actually will find these listed out in business directories. They will be written up in newspaper articles, perhaps as well there. So this is actually out of the Wolf Point Herald. So this is from 1928. So we do see this again had been around for quite a number of years, and we'll start to see it listed out here, and we can look for articles written as well in the newspaper about it. There's also the Needlework Guild, which was established in 1882. Did I say that right? Needlework Guild. And this is an example. This is the Ohio Daily Press from 1949. And so maybe they were part of a craftsman guild. Okay, so again, we've come a little bit further. This one was actually founded, I think, in 1882. But again, in 1949, it is still going strong. And I've got a little excerpt out of it here. So they were writing up about, let me go back for a second. So they were writing up about this garment drive that the guild did. And so they have a nice little write-up here in the newspaper about it, because again, they want to, basically let it be known what it is they do. And so I pulled this out. This is part of that excerpt there. And they talk about, that that they had the tea. It was at the home of Mrs. Letitia Rose. It gives her address, and that she's the vice president of Unit 60. Right. So for those of you for those researchers who have Letitia Rose in their family tree, we actually know where she lives. We now know where she lives. We know some of the other women who are in there, and we know that they are married. So it does indicate to us and lets us know which ones are married as which ones are not. That is not going to be universal across the board. It also tells us, and I found this very interesting, that there are 77 branches of this type of organization, and it is an interracial and non-sectarian organization. I thought that was very interesting to see. So we start to get a feeling for, if your ancestor was part of this guild, you get an idea of what was important to them and what it was they did. And basically, they are there to collect garments, household, and other useful articles for distribution to various agencies. So they are there to serve others. Now, there's also, for those of you who might be researching the African American women in your family tree, there was an article that Renata Saunders, who is an excellent African American researcher, I think she lives in Virginia, but we're down here in Virginia, North Carolina, and she wrote a blog post for me on my website years ago, and I learned so much from just talking with her and reading her posts that she wrote. But she told me about what's called the Black Women's Club movement. And it started out, that's what it was, how it was known. And then actually, but in 1896, all the clubs that would come out actually went under what's called the National Association of Colored Women. But these are women's groups that came together. They were African American women who came together because they wanted to uplift their race and start to combat things such as the racism, poor issues with health and sanitation and education. So they took on some really big types of movements within their um, communities. And so they also had their own newspapers. And so here we see this is the Colorado Statesman. These are little snippets from 1835. And so here we have the Eliot Temple, and it talks about their meetings, when they're meeting, and who's their secretary here, and who are the women in charge. Here we have an art club, the Margaret Washington Art Club, and they are entertaining Mrs. Booker T. Washington and Mrs. Mary B. Talbert at a specially appointed luncheon. So we can start to see they are here. They mention Mrs. L.J. Burnett on Columbine Street. So we start to see women, these are African American women who are being named in the newspapers. And here's another one where they are looking at the Madam C.J. Walker Art of Hairdressing, talking about where that's going to be taught at Miss, I can't say that name, Manjali house in Glenarm Place. So again, we have an idea of women who are being mentioned in these newspapers. It's giving us locations of these women. So it's telling us their addresses, so that can help us put them in time and place and learn a little bit more about who they were and start to understand a little bit more of who they were as women and individuals. All right, so these are some of the organizations. This is just a sample of organizations that are actually available to the women in our family tree. But where do we find the records for these? Okay, what is it? I've kind of alluded to it at this point, but how do we actually find them? This is not always an easy process, and it does take quite a bit of time, or it can take quite a bit of time, but that's okay. I've got options for you. It doesn't have to be quite as hard as you think. Just don't overthink it a little bit. You want to think through it, but don't overthink it. One of the first places that I like to go to see what were some of the clubs and what were some of the organizations that were in a community is actually city directories. So this is one that this is from South Haven and Casco and Kavere. This is in Michigan. And let me go forward. So when I went through the directory, what I found was this nice little snippet in there, and it had several pages, all of the different organizations. They were not all women, but they had a lot of women's organizations here. So they had the Choral Union that was here, and they would list out, actually, this is really cool because they would list out um, the officers there. They had the WRC, which was the Women's Relief Corps here. So they had, again, the women that were listed out. We can pick up who was married, who was not married. Again, WCTU shows up again, right? And we see some of their officers as well. I have seen sometimes they will list out other members, but the interesting thing is how much information you get will vary certainly from directory to directory, but the fact that they're listing out organizations and organizations that particularly maybe are specifically for women, then that gives us a place to start when it comes to looking for our ancestors. That we could look in if they're church related, we can look in the churches. If they're such this, the next place you're going to go is actually the newspaper. Guys, when you are looking for women, when you are looking for them in their community, in their clubs, their organizations, their faith, their causes, the things that are important to them, you cannot not do newspaper research. We have to get into the newspapers to see what's going on there. We will see them written up there. Again, they want to get their information out there because they are trying to, if it's a service organization, they're trying to show who they serve. Maybe it's a fundraiser and they're trying to raise money about a cause, to donate to a cause. So there's a lot of reason for them to be in a newspaper. And remember, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Instagram and all of the social media. This was their social media, these local sections in the newspaper. So it is going to be critical. And I just got back. I've been back from Roots Tech 2025 for about a week now. And one of the things that struck me when I was out in Salt Lake City talking with the vendors is that how many newspapers sites and places to look for newspapers are all of the major genealogy databases: Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, Family Search, they have all added to their newspaper collections just by tremendous volumes of newspapers that are now available to see. There's also the sites newspapers.com, which I think that's owned by Ancestry. There's Newspaper Archives, which is owned by Story. There's Genealogy Bank. All of these folks are adding and have added a lot, just a tremendous number of newspapers to their databases. So in one sense, we have no reason not to do newspaper research, but it is difficult because they're not always in one place to find them. So that's a bit of the challenge. But one of the places, when it's time to start your newspaper research, I start with, if you're a member of a database such as Ancestry or MyHeritage, I usually start there. But the other place that you would want to start would actually be here at chroniclingamerica.com. This link, these are listed out in your handout that you have. But chroniclingamerica.gov is free. It's free, and has a tremendous number of digital newspapers. This one's at the time I made this slide, it was over 17 million pages. It's a lot that you can do, but you can search by state. You can narrow it down by year. You can also, if I were looking for something, I'm looking for women's, Women's Christian Temperance Union, so the WCTU. I would actually put that in here, and maybe I want to narrow it down for a specific state, say North Carolina, and then I would narrow down the years, and then I would put in, Women's Christian Temperance Union to see if I can get the articles that I'm looking for that way. So this is a great place to start your newspaper research because, again, it's free and it has such a large selection. Another place to look for information, things such as, say, newsletters that an organization may have written, things such as perhaps a written history, a little booklet, a history that they may have written, would be in a special collection, say at a university archive, maybe it's at a state or a local archive. And so I would actually recommend that you check out the site called Archive Grid. This is not a genealogy specific website, but it is an amazing website and resource for us as researchers. It has basically, think of it as a large card catalog. It allows us to search 7 million records. And this is all archival records. It crosses special collections in over 1,400 archival type institutions. So again, universities, university special collections, state archives. It's worth your effort to look. So this is a way to search special collections from home for free. This is a free site that you can then search and find the records. So this is a finding aid. It will not take you to the actual record, but it gets you started to find it. So if I were doing a search at ArchiveGrid and I put in women's temperance right here. And so when I did that, it says, okay, you have 1,675 results here. And then I could actually go read through. Here's one that I might be interested in looking at. Temperance Organization records from 1868 to 1905. This is looks like the repository is the New York State Historical Document. So I'm like, I think this might be something I'm interested in. I would click on that, and then it would take me to this page, which would tell me all the information about this particular collection. Again, this is telling me how to find the record, not giving me the record directly. And so it tells me that this is 5 volumes. It goes a little more detailed about what it is. It's records of the local Staten Island chapters of Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Sons and Daughters of Temperance. And it's telling me it's the Pomona Division, the New Springfield chapter. So this is telling me a little bit more about it. If it's one that I want to get, then I would actually just hit contact information. And so I would reach out to that repository to see how could I go about actually obtaining these, being able to look at these records. So you can see it right here. It tells us very specifically, and then you would hit that button to contact. Some of the things that I've been seeing recently when I've been on Archive Grid in the last year would be sometimes they will give you a link if the records have been digitized, sometimes they'll actually give you a link and you can go directly to the records. So just be sure and read through what information they give you there. Religious newspapers. Do not overlook the religious newspapers because they're going to be crucial to your research as well. Things such as the Biblical Recorder. Now, the Biblical Recorder has been published since well over 100 years. I believe it is 1835. So it has been around for many, many years. Obviously, it records Baptist life in North Carolina. And so if you have ancestors who are part of the Baptist church, women included, you may want to do some searches in looking through that newspaper as well, because again, you would start to see the Baptist women groups formed and you could learn a little bit more about them. You can also do the Chronicling America. So the Chronicling America I just mentioned a moment ago, which is a free resource. You can search for topics. So I searched for the Methodist newspapers. I thought, let's see what Methodist newspapers are there. And it tells me that there were 268 newspapers that are specific to the Methodist Church. It listed them out here. It tells me here's number one, United Methodist Reporter. It's from Dallas, Texas, 1976 to 1991. But they definitely have older ones as well. Down here at the bottom, Methodist Advocate from Sutton, West Virginia, 1915 to 1917. Now, these are not digitized, or most likely not digitized, but it does tell you what was published. And that's part of figuring it out first. And then clicking through would take you to information on how to actually find the who holds the original newspaper that you could reach out to. Oh, so that was a lot. So let's pull this around a little bit. We've talked a lot about our ancestors' clubs, the societies. It could be a social cause. It could be a faith-based group. It could even be a quilting bee, guys. It's the community groups that are important to your ancestor. And remember what I said at the beginning, if something was important to your ancestor, it's important to you. You may not be a quilter, but if your ancestor was and she entered into the fair, that's important to you. She was part of that quilting bee. If she was, fighting for women's rights, that would be important to you. And we see these things showing up in newspapers and directories, and we want to make sure that we're looking at them because, again, we have to learn about our ancestors' life so that then we can potentially find the clues. Because women were not necessarily in those formal records, but they were living really, I want to say, exciting lives. They were living more than just in their homes. They were in their communities and being part of their communities. And it's who they were involved with. Oftentimes you find multiple women in the same family, in the same groups. And so that can help you start to put the pieces together as well. So again, as I was saying, we have to essentially recreate her life to actually start to break down those brick walls. And it's those memberships, those important clues that tell us a little bit more about her and other family members as well. So again, I'm going to say it again because it's so, so, so important. If something was important to your ancestor, it's important to you in your research. Okay, so guys, I will come back and take questions. Definitely though, if you want to reach out, feel free to do that at my email, my website, or my YouTube channel, either one, perfectly. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, Pam, and I'm going to come back. Sure, you're still there. I always wonder if
We're
everybody's just
still
still going to be
there.
there when
Yes. Excellent.
yeah.
Excellent. So much information. We've got a few
Oh,
questions.
thank you.
Take a drink of water. You have a lot to present there. So much information, and I just want to make sure we point back to that handout because so much of what the resources you gave are in that handout. And I think the link to that's in our chat. So first question up is, do you have any recommendations for groups or organizations for Lutheran churches? You pointed out some other denominations early on.
Yeah, so I don't know as many about the Lutheran Church, but you could actually, certainly you can Google it, but you could also go to ChatGPT and ask what women's groups were common in the Lutheran Church in whatever year so like 1880 to 1885 in Missouri. So you could ask it to see what if it could narrow it down for you just a little bit.
Yeah, so we've done a few of these presentations together. I've not heard you talk about Chat GPT.
Just wait, we got more to go. Just call me back. Pam, I got more on that.
Yeah, definitely. Here's the next question. My mother and her female ancestors belonged to the Grange and the Civic Club where they grew up in Pennsylvania. How might I find out more information on those two groups?
I would certainly look in the newspapers first to see if they're writing up what it was they did. I would also reach out to the local library there and ask them what they might have on them. If I'm not familiar with those, so if they were more local to that particular area as opposed to say a state or national, that and even if they were, the library could very well have some local resources about them on that. And then also, here's another thought would be to check the vertical file in the library close to where they
Mhm.
were at because they may have some information that maybe didn't end up in a state archive somewhere, but those are the places I find things like newsletters sometimes and rosters and things like that.
Fantastic. Pointing back to the library, we always love that part.
They didn't pay me to say that either.
There you go. So here's the next question. Um, this person says their ancestor lived in Indiana. What can you tell me about the improved order of red men? My great grandmother was a Pocahontas, the women's branch order of this.
I have never heard of that, to be honest. So, if she was in Indiana, I would one reach out to the state archives to see what they might know about it. And then, yeah, I would actually put that in Chat GPT and ask about that. Ask about what it is, the way, and I would say, I would ask Chat GPT and say, um, I would actually put your question in, what you put in. I would say, what can you tell me about improved order of red men? And can you tell me about the women's branch of this order as well? Where to find the records? What records exist and where could I find them? You
Yeah,
could actually ask it that way.
yeah. It just goes to show that between the communities and the states and the territories, there's so many of these clubs and organizations. It's just you can't have a handle on all of them.
I am always amazed at the ones that people come up. I'm like, whoa. I mean, I feel like I've heard of a lot, and then people will ask, I'm like, oh yeah, I've just like touched the tip of the iceberg.
But you do get the juices flowing up there to think about all those little niches that were filled.
Yeah, and that's really kind of the point when I talk about this is I may not have covered, your particular group that your ancestor was in, but if you start to think about, okay, let's think through her life. What did she do? What do I know? What can I know? I
Mhm,
want to get people thinking, as I saw outside the box a little
mhm.
bit.
So next question. I found a membership card for my grandmother who lives in central New York, early 1920s. Says she belonged to a Greek organization like Theta Chi. Not sure it's spelled correctly, but I do know that she did not go to college where you'd would expect to find a sorority. So is it normal for sororities outside of college campuses? I have not been able to find anything about the organization in any of the genealogy websites or fultonhistory.com, which has indexed newspapers from all over New York.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm wondering if it's actually a sorority. I mean, it's a Greek organization, but I'm wondering if it's a different type and not necessarily a sorority type
Mhm.
thing. That it is it's in central New York early. I would actually reach out to if you said central New York, but I would reach out to the county library or the regional library there and pose that question to them to see if they might have some local resources on that. Um, because I think sometimes I've heard of groups. I'm trying to remember exactly, but they sound Greek, but they're not necessarily sororities, and they're not associated with a sorority at college.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. Thank you. Let's go on to the next one. Is there a resource available which encompasses nursing and teaching, two industries that were typically open to women?
So there could be, say, there could be like schools that would have like nursing schools, early nursing schools that would have yearbooks. I've seen those out there, as well as I will see those written up in the newspapers. Sometimes I can't say there's like one resource specific that I've seen for that, but I would check locally, some of the nursing schools. I know my mother actually worked in a nursing school. She was the only non-nurse there, but that school started early in the 1900s and in the county where we lived, and you would see them throughout, you would see them written up in the newspaper. You would see their graduation classes that were out there as well. So you might want to check a little more locally for where you're at on that.
Very good. Is it worth checking out with national organizations such as YWCA, Girl Scouts, or the Ladies' Ancient Order of the Hibernians?
It may depend a little bit on the time period that you would reach out for. Um, I think you could if you. I honestly, with the Girl Scouts, I think you're probably gonna. I think Girl Scouts. I think I probably wouldn't go after that. They're a little. I think they're probably a little tighter on on some of that privacy stuff as far as what they would give out to. I'm not so sure about the YWCA or the other one that you mentioned. What might be helpful would be to if you reached out to see, do they have their own archives? So churches, so a lot of churches have their own national archives, um, that pertain the history of their churches. It's possible that these organizations, I know the Girl Scouts certainly are large enough, the YWCA is large enough, that they might have kind of their own historical section, and it might be worth seeing if they have a historian on staff that would talk with you.
Mhm. Good information. Let's see. Next one. When reaching out to churches for their societies or clubs or groups, is it best to reach out to that exact church first, or is it better to reach out to the records place of that religion? For example, the Archdiocese of Baltimore, to confirm if an answer is a member of any churches in their jurisdiction.
Yeah, so a lot of times I start with the church first. I try to reach out to the church historian. I'll call and ask. For the, I will say, for Catholic churches, I don't typically have much success with that. But you might need to go a little higher up. I usually get referred to, I think there's oftentimes a historical section or an archive type section for the archdiocese. So I would probably reach out to the archdiocese for that. But if it's a local church, more like a Protestant church, I'm thinking I do a lot of rural type of research. I'll reach out to the church itself first and start there.
Okay, very good. That's all the questions I see. Let me see if there's anything in chat that I missed. Um, my goodness gracious. Can you please reshare the name of the woman who shared a post on your page with the African American genealogy?
Her name is Renata Saunders.
And say that again, I'm sorry.
Renata Saunders,
Okay.
RE. Let me actually hang on. If you give me just a second, I'll pop her post
Oh,
in
great,
my.
great. Thank you.
I'll pop the post in my. I'm sorry. It might take me
No,
two
you're fine.
moments just because I
Not a,
just read. I literally just this week last week redesigned my website, so I'm still getting used to all the all the bells and whistles on that.
Mhm.
Let's see. Hang on.
And there are some comments in the chat about Girl Scouts and other questions that came up. People have some personal information there to share.
Oh, good.
That's worth reading that.
Here we go.
And also about the
Um,
Greek organization, some information. If you're familiar with their hobbies or
yes.
interests, that particular organization, like chemistry is service-based, that might help lead back to that Greek organization. Um, and the Girl Scouts, I think they were kind of stating the same as you, maybe not the national level might not be the place to go. It might be the actual um, organization they belong to locally
Yeah. Hang on.
to
I'm
find
gonna
those
give you.
records.
I'm pulling up Renata's name.
That's
Hang
fine.
on one sec.
Somebody asked about
Um,
the handout. We can repost that in our chat. Um, Very good. Yeah. So the chat in the chat, the handout has been reposted. There's a question about this being recorded. Yes, it's recorded and we'll have it online for 4 weeks. And then Lisa just posted the African American ancestors link. So we do appreciate that.
yeah. If you go, it's on my website. If you go there, you'll find Renata's information down at the bottom. You'll find her contact information at the bottom there too.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. I don't see any other chat or open questions. Just lots of kudos and thanks. I mean, just
Oh,
so much
thank you.
information, so many things to think about. Like I said, kind of got the wheels in motion, thinking about the things that we heard our grandparents talk about that were important to them, and now trying to make those links backwards to find out more about it.
Yep, that's what we do.
That is what we do. That's what you do very, very well. And I suspect we'll have you back doing something else. We've had some conversations about some other programs you might be doing. So um, those of you that follow us, take a look at that. I'm sure we'll have some announcements sometime soon about other programs with Lisa. Just a reminder too, that to take a look at our website, HCPL Online, and we have genealogy resources there. You're going to find links to Ancestry, Fold 3, and Family Search. And each of these sites offer tutorials to help you navigate your way through all that wonderful information. And Ancestry Library Editions is available inside our library branches. And Hartford County Public Library is an affiliate library for Family Search, and access to the enhanced digital content is available only in Bel Air. So if you go to the branch, you can use the public library computers there. And there's no remote access, but that's some other resources if you're local. I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you, Lisa, again for another great presentation. As we said, this presentation was recorded and will be available along with that handout at hcplonline.org for the next 4 weeks. And if you can please do that really quick survey after the credits, we really do use your input in choosing our topics. So we really would appreciate if you could do that for us. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your week.
Bye.
Bye.